All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. If you're not yet familiar with YIVO, or if it's been a moment, I'll remind you that YIVO is a special place for the contemplation and the celebration of Jewish history and culture, including, of course, Jewish literature. So we're so glad to have you here today for a book talk with Curt Leviant. I'll let you know as we get started that today's event is being recorded and we will post it on our YouTube channel. So you'll be welcome to watch it again in the future, share it with your friends, and also view videos of YIVO's past programs as well on our YouTube channel. If you have questions throughout the event, we'd be curious to hear them. So you're welcome to type your questions for Curt in the Q&A function on Zoom. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dvora Reich, who's going to introduce Curt and lead him in a conversation on his new translation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so delighted to be joined by participants from around the country, and it looks like around the world. Let me give a brief introduction of our guest speaker, Mr. Curt Leviant. Curt Leviant is an internationally known translator into English of 5 volumes of Sholem Aleichem's works, besides the short novel Moshkeleh the Thief, who is the subject of today's interview. Curt Leviant has also translated Chaim Grade, Isaac Bashevis Singer, and other noted Yiddish writers. Mr. Leviant is also deeply immersed in Hebrew literature. He has translated stories by Israel's Nobel laureate Shai Agnon and other Israeli writers. He has compiled and edited a widely used anthology of Hebrew writings titled Masterpieces of Hebrew Literature, an anthology of 2,000 years of Jewish creativity. And he edited and translated the classic Jewish Golem story in a volume called The Golem and the Wondrous Deeds of the Maharal of Prague, which is a 1909 Hebrew novel by Yudel Rosenberg that had never before been translated into English. Curt Leviant is also a prize-winning, internationally published novelist. Some of his novels have been translated into 9 European languages and Hebrew. His widely hailed novel, Diary of an Adulterous Woman, was an international bestseller, and critics have acclaimed his imaginative fiction and compared him to the greats such as Tolstoy, Flaubert, Kundera, and Kafka. Curt Leviant's 12th novel, a love story set in the Jewish ghetto of Venice, will be published this December, and its title is Me, Mo, Mu, Ma, and Mad, or Which Will It Be, Me and Mazel, or Gila and Me? And Curt, I hope I pronounced that correctly. And before I start my conversation with Curt, I wanted to share with you what a couple of noted experts in Yiddish literature have to say about Moshkeleh the Thief. From Jeremy Dauber, professor at Columbia University, Mr. Dauber says, "This almost forgotten novel by one of the greatest Jewish writers of all times is revelatory, vividly depicting an all too rarely seen side of Yiddish literature and Jewish life. Its rendering here by one of Jewish literature's greatest translators provides a crackling energy befitting its material. Don't start it too late in the evening, you won't be able to put it down. Sage advice." And another by Professor Robert Alter of the University of California at Berkeley. "This rediscovered short novel by Sholem Aleichem is a gem, a vivid representation of the underside of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. Funny, touching, and biting. Curt Leviant has done a remarkable job with the English translation, aptly catching the pungent colloquial character of the Yiddish. And finally, from the novelist Dara Horn, Moshkeleh Ganev, or Moshkeleh the Thief, flies in the face of so much of what we think of when we imagine Eastern European Jewish life. Here, Sholem Aleichem brings us the broadest of visions of that world, not merely by dramatizing the shady characters on society's margins, but also by inviting us into their emotional lives and uncovering the complicated power structures that can turn them into heroes. For any reader who cares about the Jewish past, this never before translated gem, that word again, will be a revelation and a delight. So, welcome, Curt. How about if we begin with you giving our audience a brief introduction of who Sholem Aleichem was and the intriguing way you discovered or rediscovered Moshkeleh the Thief.
Well, Sholem Aleichem was born in 1859 in a little town of Pereyaslav in Ukraine, and early on was interested in Yiddish, in Hebrew. Strangely enough, his first publications were in Hebrew and not in Yiddish. But he soon captured the vivid imagination of his reading public. His star rose, and he became ultimately the best known and most widely read and beloved writer of Yiddish literature. He visited the United States twice, came in 1905, spent a couple of years in the United States, went back to Europe, and returned in 1914 to spend the last 2 years of his life in New York City. When he died at the age of 57 in New York City in 1916, his funeral was attended by 150,000 people. The New York Times featured this funeral and procession on page 1 and called it the largest funeral that New York City had ever seen. One of the oddities with Yiddish writers is that you could be the most famous writer in Yiddish in the world, and your pocket is not full. Sholem Aleichem, during the last 2 years of his life, he suffered from tuberculosis, wanted desperately to be able to get to Denver, Colorado, which was then the home for people who were seeking relief from consumption or from tuberculosis. And he could not afford to go to Denver. And sadly, he died ill, well known, but poor.
So let's segue back to the novella that we're talking about today, Moshkeleh the Thief. He's not included in the collected works of Sholem Aleichem. Why is that not the case? How did you figure that out? And what did you do about it?
Well, when I first noticed, and I won't go into the details, I'll let the reader who gets Moshkeleh the Thief read how I discovered Moshkeleh. But we know, as soon as I discovered that this book exists, the first thing I did was go to my 28-volume complete works of Sholem Aleichem and see where this is. I could not find Moshkeleh Ganev or Moshkeleh the Thief as part of the collected works of Sholem Aleichem. I cannot tell you why. I can only speculate. The speculation is that because it was about an underclass figure, about a thief, that perhaps Sholem Aleichem's son-in-law, Berkowitz, who was the editor of this 28 volumes, and other members of the family thought that it was not appropriate. But the main thing is, now that we have Moshkeleh, the thief, in English, it is an added star or gem to the collected works of Sholem Aleichem.
And you know, Curt, that this book, Moshkeleh, the thief, was one of Sholem Aleichem's either favorite story or one that he was most proud of or one that he was very excited about.
Exactly so. He wrote a letter, I don't know to whom, but the letter is quoted saying that I have found the equivalent of renewed strength in composing Moshkeleh Ganev. Perhaps he was very proud of the fact that he, for the first time in Yiddish literature, he was writing about a class that had never been written about in Yiddish literature. Thieves, the lowest elements or the lowest strata of Jewish society. This was quite innovative. And I feel that by writing about thieves, by writing about fences, by writing about pickpockets, he paved the way for other Yiddish writers to write about the sort of life that had never been depicted, but which indeed did exist. And that's why generation and a half later, Isaac Bashevis Singer was able to write freely about all aspects of life, Jewish life, including violence, sex, and so forth.
So Moshkeleh really is an anomaly amongst Sholem Aleichem's heroes, one that operates outside the fringes of respectable society, but a very likable character nonetheless, a thief with a big heart, and who gets himself into an unlikely romantic entanglement, one that he only dreamed about, but never, thought he would be able to attain.
Right.
So
by the way, he doesn't like the term Moshkeleh, the thief, or Moshkeleh Ganev. The truth of the matter is, if you read the book carefully, Sholem Aleichem never shows us one instance where he has stolen something. But he does do a stealing much later in a very positive sense. And again, the reader will enjoy how this theft takes place and enhances Moshkeleh's life thereafter.
Talk to us a little bit about the role of, the archetype of Moshkeleh within the pantheon of Sholem Aleichem's writings, and in particular, it is part of the social strata of the shtetl.
The social strata here is of the lowest. Moshkeleh Ganev and his father, who is a fence, when somebody comes up to his father, Yonah, who's called Yonah the prophet, and says, my horses have been stolen. And the prophet, in other words, Moshkeleh's father, says, okay, he says, if you give me 10 rubles, I'll find out where your 2 horses are, and tomorrow morning you'll find them back in your barn. So Sholem Aleichem is depicting the lowest levels of society. Moreover, when he's dealing with the tavern keeper, his pretty wife and his daughters, we never really find out how many daughters he has because the numbers keep shifting. But in any case, they're pretty girls, and they're serving Jews and non-Jews in the tavern. And as Sholem Aleichem tells us, once in a while they get pinched here and there. So again, the tavern keeper, his wife, and his daughters are not in the middle class society. I say that the average tailor, Schneider, or shoemaker, Schuster, would not have his son marry one of the tavern keeper's daughters, because that would be going below his class. Mm-hmm. So we do have the lowest levels depicted by Sholem Aleichem very lovingly, and giving us a really beautiful snapshot of a society that existed but was not written about. Just let me add about being a tavern keeper. Jews were tavern keepers. You must have run across family names like Schenker, one of the great advocates and interpreters of Hasidic Mojitz music was a man named Ben Zion Schenker, meaning that a Schenk is the Yiddish word for tavern. His great-grandfather perhaps owned and operated a tavern, and the Russian government permitted and in fact encouraged Jews to be tavern keepers because they could be trusted to pay the excise tax, and they could also be trusted not to deplete the stock.
And is this the first time that the relationship between Jews and non-Jews are so deeply
I've discovered that to be the case. I don't know of any other Sholem Aleichem work, with the exception of one of Tevye's daughters runs off with a non-Jew and then returns. You know, the famous story of Tevye, Fiddler on the Roof. But to depict the relationship very, very particularly between Chubinsky, the non-Jew who falls in love with Cyril, the tavern keeper's daughter. This is a groundbreaking theme in Yiddish literature, which Sholem Aleichem exploited to his advantage.
Tell our audience when you were first exposed to the works of Sholem Aleichem.
Oh.
A step back.
I love that question, yeah.
And how did your lifelong love of Sholem Aleichem unfold?
Well, when I was a late teenager, my beloved Tate Yaakov gave me a copy of one of Sholem Aleichem's books. I started reading it, and the next morning he tells my mother, Elaine the ganze Nacht und lacht. He reads all night long and keeps on laughing. And as I was reading, indeed, the words in English kept flying through my mind. And very shortly thereafter, I made my first effort in translating Sholem Aleichem's, one of Sholem Aleichem's stories. It got published. And from then on, I kept on working with Sholem Aleichem.
You brought up the process of translating. Can you talk to us a little bit about your translation process?
You look at the words, you look at the sentence, and in your mind, you say to yourself, which would be the best way to render this in English? Obviously not word for word, but trying to give the feeling into the new language, the same feeling, the same expression, the same articulation that the original writer wanted. So sometimes you have to play around with words. Is this the better word? Is this the better phrase? But the ultimate goal is to be able to put into English the mood, the character, the plot that the original writer, in this case, Sholem Aleichem, had in mind for his readers. And
along this vein, I've also heard you talk about the difference between Yiddish and Yiddishkeit, which makes you aptly experienced and.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that's also a wonderful question. You know, you could be knowledgeable in Yiddishkeit and be totally ignorant of Yiddish. Let's say a typical American-born Jew who gets a yeshiva education, is an observant Jew, has studied the Tanakh, has studied a little bit of Talmud. He's dealing with Hebrew, Aramaic. He may know a couple of words in Yiddish like shul, going to the synagogue or daven to pray, but he doesn't know Yiddish. But somebody who translates from Yiddish must know Yiddishkeit. In other words, you know the language, either you're born into it or you've studied it carefully, but if you don't know liturgy, holidays, the entire mainstream of what Jewish life is in its pishchevikis, as the Russian word has it, in all its details, then you cannot be an apt translator. I've run across guys who were, of course, unnamed, heads of Jewish literature departments who've done some translation. And when it comes to tashlich, they put in the footnote, when Jews take breadcrumbs before Passover and throw it into the water, totally turning the Rosh Hashanah mode of casting your sins into the water and bringing Pesach into Rosh Hashanah. So that's an excellent example of how people who think they know Yiddish but don't know Yiddishkeit, and hence they err in their transcription of the language.
I want to remind our audience members that they can go into the chat and submit questions that Jane will read out afterwards in case anyone has questions that I haven't thought about. We know that Sholem Aleichem was very well read. How do you think his readings of secular literature influenced his own writing?
He knew the works of Chekhov, Tolstoy, Gogol, a bit of the surrealism, certainly the compassion of Chekhov appears in Sholem Aleichem's stories. Some of the humor, sometimes absurd humor of Gogol appears in Sholem Aleichem. He knew Tolstoy, not personally, but when the occasion arose, he was able to write to both Chekhov and to Tolstoy. If you want to have the details of this, I'd be glad to elaborate on it.
Sure, why don't you take a minute and elaborate?
Okay. In 1903, the very same year that Sholem Aleichem serialized Moshkeleh in that Warsaw Yiddish paper in 20 installments, there was this notorious pogrom in Kishinev. 49 people were killed, but this so shook the world because of its horror in Bessarabia, in the town of Kishinev, that Sholem Aleichem wanted to raise some money for the victims. And he was planning to assemble an anthology of writings in Yiddish, and the total proceeds of this book would go to the family members of the victims. He wrote to Tolstoy, he wrote to Chekhov, he told them about this, and he said, would you contribute a story? And I personally will translate it from the Russian to the Yiddish. And decent human beings that they were, both Tolstoy and Chekhov submitted stories to him, which were included in this anthology.
That is absolutely fascinating.
It is a fascinating footnote to literary history.
Literary history. The book that we're talking about, Moshkeleh, the Thief, is pretty funny. I thought it was quite a humorous story, even though it had some dark moments too. But many of Sholem Aleichem's books, some of your translations, specifically, some laughter, some tears, his own autobiography, From the Fair, really encapsulate the sadness and the difficulty in living in a shtetl and the Pale of Settlement. Can you talk to us about Sholem Aleichem, the humorist, and Sholem Aleichem, the realist?
Very fine distinction. The humor is there in the characters, in the behavior, in their interrelations, with realism at the same time. For instance, he has a story that's called the Yom Kippur Scandal, where on Yom Kippur, there seems to be a robbery that was taking place in the shul, and they had to search every single person in that shul. They look, they find no money on anybody, and the last person who was searched, they find a few pieces of dried fruit and a couple of crumbs of a piece of challah from the previous feast, the Erev Yom Kippur feast. So we are faced with the comical tragedy of a young man eating secretly on Yom Kippur, and when his pockets were searched for the money that apparently had been stolen somewhere. So he combines realism, a little bit of Gogol's surrealism, and Chekhov's compassion in this story. This is just one example that comes to mind. When he deals with Tevye, it's very, very realistic. But of course, Tevye, with his earthy, robust character and his sayings, leads to laughter. So this combination, there's no curtain really drawn between realism and humor. It depends which side of the curtain you're peeking in from.
Very interesting. Do you have any comments that you'd like to share about Moshkeleh the Thief before we turn to some of your own writings?
Well, Moshkeleh the Thief is a wonderful creation. He's real, he's palpable, he's human, he takes on, we don't see him doing any thievery, but when a brutish fellow, a non-Jew, gets shicker, gets drunk in the tavern, and he starts, after doing his usual breaking of windows, he starts attacking the Jewish woman tavern keeper, and Moshkeleh hears about this. He flies in from wherever he is, and he beats up, he bloodies this Goyish attacker to the point where blood is running out of his ears, nose, and every place else. But the next day, this Ivan Kurka, who was beaten, comes in with a dozen eggs, asks in town, where can I find Moshkeleh? Of course, the people are wary of giving Moshkeleh's address, but he finds him, he presents him with the eggs, and Sholem Aleichem tells us that thereafter they became bosom pals. There's no hint of anti-Semitism at all in this story. So that when Ivan is plying his violence, it's just because he's a shikker, he's a drunkard. There's no anti-Semitic tone there whatsoever. And the relationship that we see a little bit later on, where Maxim Trubinsky, the goy, comes to court the tavern keeper's daughter, it's also a very friendly relationship. And the mother is of Maxim, the goy, the Gentile, is also encouraging this. So the relationships in this story between Jew and Gentile are quite good.
And even though you spoke earlier about how this isn't really a story of Edelkeit because of the brawny, off-color thievery of our hero, he has Edelkeit, or refinement, as it's translated, interlaced within him.
Nice observation. Yeah, yes, he does. And he does good deeds. And when he's needed, the old expression, "Lemedavta Ganev," from the Tliya. When you need a Ganev, you take him off the scaffolding of the hangman's noose. So when they needed him, when the Jewish community needed Moshkeleh Ganev, or Moshkeleh the Thief, they call him, and he is very, very willing to answer, and he succeeds. But how he succeeds, I'll leave that up to the reader to find out when he gets the book.
You surmise that perhaps one of the reasons that this was not included in the collection of posthumously published stories, collection of Sholem Aleichem stories, is because it did not have Edelkeit. It was cruder.
Correct. Yeah. That's what my estimation is. There's no proof of that. Maybe because it did not have the rollicking, laugh aloud humor of some of his other stories. My hunch is that his family thought that the focus on a Ganev and on the lower caste of the Jewish shtetl society was reason enough to exclude Moshkeleh Ganev from the collected works, but as we mentioned, it was republished in Eastern Europe, once in Poland and twice in the Soviet Union, even under Stalin, which is totally surprising.
Before we go on to your own novels, one of the things I greatly enjoyed was the cadence of the story, because it was a serial publication where you had to have a little bit of a cliffhanger at the end of each chapter to kind of whet your appetite to run out and buy the paper next time. It was fun to actually read it all in one sitting, and watch how the cliffhangers.
Yeah, the ups and downs, and
ups and downs.
At each chapter, of course, when one chapter was published on Friday in that Warsaw paper, there was always something to lure you on to buy the paper the next Friday to continue the story.
Yes. We know you're a novelist, and I mentioned in the introduction that your novels have been translated into 9 European languages and into Hebrew. And I was wondering if you see any link between your involvement with Yiddish and your own fiction.
Well, let's talk about translation for a moment. In both translating and in fiction, we choose our words carefully. For translation, the text is before you. For fiction, the text sort of runs like a stream of letters across your mind's eye, and then you write it down. But nuances of phrasing, originality, the joy of words, images, and sentences is what links creative writing and translation. I don't think a person can be a good translator without writing well, and vice versa, if he knows another language. Some of our best writers of fiction, by the way, have been translators too. Saul Bellow, our great American writer who won the Nobel Prize, brought Isaac Bashevis Singer to fame with his translation of Gimple the Fool. I think this is the only instance that I know in world literature where one future Nobel laureate translated another future Nobel laureate. By the way, Sholem Aleichem himself was translating. As we mentioned, he translated from Russian literature into Yiddish. And Isaac Babel, the great Soviet Jewish short story writer whom Stalin ordered murdered in 1939, Isaac Babel was the classic translator of Sholem Aleichem into Russian. So we have this wonderful interplay between translation and creation, and seamlessly.
And how about your own novels, your own fiction? Is there a connection between Yiddish? I mean, I know that you've.
Oh, listen, good. That reminds me. I have a novel called King of Yiddish.
Oh yeah, that's what I was reading.
Which was written, supposedly, they say, about whose hero is supposedly a professor of Yiddish literature at a university in Israel. But of course, I deny that absolutely. I have a novel called The Man Who Thought He Was Messiah, which indeed was written about, and I have no qualms about saying, Reb Nachman of Bratslav, the great Hasidic leader, great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, and a wonderful short story writer of his own. And in fact, in The Man Who Thought He Was Messiah, Reb Nachman of Bratslav is a writer who also is a composer of melodies that he cannot write down, he cannot remember them. Since this takes place in 1800, somebody says to him, there's a great composer who lives in Vienna, who's getting more and more famous. Why don't you go to him? Maybe he would give you lessons. So Reb Nachman, this is of course all created, it doesn't exist in real life, but Reb Nachman goes to Vienna, meets Beethoven, and learns how to notate music. So there's another Yiddish connection. Let's see. Yeah, there's another novel called A Novel of Class, Klass, which some people say is based upon another famous Yiddish writer who in the novel happens to be a noted painter. He calls himself a Yiddish artist. Of course, that too, since it's set in modern times, I deny completely, and I say, you don't know what you're talking about.
And with that, thank you so much. I'm sure that a lot of our audience members have questions as well. Jane, would this be a good time for you or Alex to step in and maybe take some questions from our audience?
Can't hear you.
Yes, perfect timing. So we have quite a few questions from the chat. We'll try and answer at least some of them. If anyone else has questions that they would like to add to the Q&A function here on Zoom, you're welcome to do so now. So first, we'll start off for some who may have missed the very beginning. Curt, did you want to explain how you came across the book?
No.
Where should folks find that out?
Well, listen, that no is a little bit too blatant. It was discovered, and if you read the introduction to Moshkeleh the Thief, you'll see where and how I discovered it. But we have to accept the fact that this is new because Moshkeleh the Thief, or Moshkeleh Ganev, was not included in the classic 28-volume collection of Sholem Aleichem's works, that a project that was initiated within a couple of years after his death in New York City in 1916, which his son-in-law Berkovitz and other members of the family were deeply involved in. It was not part of that collection, but now that we have the book in English, we can say that Moshkeleh Ganev, Moshkeleh the Thief, is now part of the Sholem Aleichem oeuvre.
Another question we have, how is the experience of translating the content of Sholem Aleichem different from that of the experience of translating, say, Chaim Grade?
Wonderful question. For Chaim Grade, before I was mentioning the knowledge of Yiddishkeit that is needed, when you're translating Chaim Grade, you have to be aware of all aspects of Yiddishkeit. In the novel, The Yeshiva, which is Grade's great work, 2-volume, The Yeshiva, which I translated, there are on occasion when rabbis are conversing with one another, their Yiddish is almost 80 or 85% Hebrew, because they're throwing Hebrew, Aramaic, Jewish-themed words back and forth in Hebrew with perhaps the and the is or are as the only connectives in Yiddish. So certainly for Chaim Grade, you need to have a deep immersion in Yiddishkeit. You have to know the entire gamut of what Jewish life is all about. With Sholem Aleichem, of course, you need Yiddish. Sometimes you need knowledge of Slavic, and I had to run both to my Russian dictionary after having taken a couple of courses in Russian, and most importantly, to run to my parents, who are native Russian and Yiddish speakers, to help me out with some of the rare Slavic terms.
Sorry. Another question about another writer. An audience member wants to know, would Isaac Babel have read this book before writing Odessa Stories?
Magnificent question. I can only give you an answer which is totally impoverished. I do not know. I do not know. There was an edition that came out in Kiev in 1929. Babel lived in Moscow, so I don't know whether he was aware of it. But if he was aware of it, maybe it did have some influence. But don't forget, Odessa and his living in Odessa when he was there was so rich and full of Jewish life that I don't think you needed the inspiration of any Sholem Aleichem story to gather those great characters, Benya Krik and others in the underworld that Isaac Babel wrote about.
So we have another question that might be one more of speculation as well, which is, do we have a sense of how Aleichem was thinking of his own body of work? For instance, where he might have rated this book versus other books such as Tevye?
Tell your questioner that it's a wonderful question, but I can't match my answer to the high level of that question. I have no clue as to where to begin with that question. Very, very speculative.
That's fair. A question that came across, I don't want to give away too much of the plot points, but essentially the question was about a romanticization of some of the more violent elements of the book. So if you wanted to address that concern that an audience member had brought up.
When Ivan Kurka and Moshkeleh are battling each other, there is no curtain in Sholem Aleichem's language. He describes how they've hit each other. He describes the bloody nose and ears, and he has no hesitation in describing this little violent scene. Contra to this, in other works, when pogroms took place, a pogrom was never depicted. It took 40 years later for the great Yiddish writer Lamed Shapiro to literally photograph in words pogroms. In Sholem Aleichem, when a Jew from Russia is writing to a cousin in the United States, he says, I heard from somebody that he had gotten a letter that a pogrom had taken place in the town of XXX, a tertiary experience of a pogrom. But yet here in Moshkeleh the Thief, we do see them smacking each other, and Sholem Aleichem is not censoring this scene at all.
I'll note here we have a note from a descendant of Sholem Aleichem himself, who may be in attendance. So from Ken, I'll read out his note for a moment. He says, Curt Leviant has been a stalwart friend of the family of Sholem Aleichem. We are grateful to him for his brilliant translation of my great-grandfather's work, which now includes this long-forgotten novel, Moshkeleh the Thief, that we think readers will surely want to add to their collection. We greatly appreciate his contribution to literature and for his friendship. So thanks for that note from Ken. And to move on to our next question, someone wants to know, Curt, if you would speculate to the audience members' suspicion that the ending, they put in quotes, is meant to be a, quote, bridge to more chapters, perhaps to be set in Siberia.
Well, tell that questioner that I give him an assignment to continue that Moshkeleh story. I don't know if, it's amazing how many times I'm saying I don't know after assuming that I know a lot, but I don't know what Sholem Aleichem would have done afterwards. I thought he concluded this going to the, it's not quite the equivalent of the Stalin Gulag, because when you got to Siberia, people settled in, they got apartments or houses. You notice that the in these typical situations where a man was sent off to Siberia, to Irkutsk or other developing towns in the far northeast of Russia, the wives and the children, the wife and the child or the children accompanied them on a voluntary basis. So Siberia, although it was exile, it was not the gulag of 2 generations later under Stalin.
Thank you for that. The next question we have from one of our audience members, and thank you so much, Curt, for answering all of these questions. In the introduction to the book, You mentioned Kiev and Moscow editions. Were those books widely available?
I think the questioner is aware that I'm going to give my stereotypical "I don't know" answer. But let me tell you that the very fact that under Stalin in 29, he was in power in 29, died in 53, and he was in power in 1941, it still amazes me that Yiddish literature, which Stalin tried to destroy, both the Hebrew and the Yiddish literature had permission, because you couldn't do any publishing in the Soviet Union without permission. The fact that permission was granted in 29 in Kiev and in 41 in Moscow still astonishes me. Could it have slipped through without a Stalin supervision? Perhaps. But the fact that it did appear was really stunning and amazing.
Another question from our audience. They write, so much of Sholem Aleichem lends itself to dramatization for the stage, Fiddler being the prime example. What would you, Curt, think about having Moshkeleh the Thief be read as a play or turned into a play?
I'd love to see it. Love to see it as a play. Love to see it as a film. I think it is absolutely stunningly photogenic. But there is an irony in Sholem Aleichem's career. He wrote dramas, but they were not successful. When he came to the United States first in 1905, he was lured to this country with the promise that his plays would be staged. That promise was not kept, and he returned after a couple of years back to Europe. So there is this strange irony. His plays were not successful, but yet adaptations of his stories, especially the Tevye stories, to stage and film was remarkably successful. If there are any filmmakers out there, have them contact me and we can talk about film rights for Moshkeleh the Thief.
That applies to anyone in the audience. Feel free to reach out, of course. We have a question from someone who's interested in reading the original of this text alongside your translation. And for anyone who is a Yiddish speaker or learner, of course, you may know YIVO offers Yiddish classes. So if you want to get yourself up to the level of being able to read translation and the original, you can check out YIVO's website for more information about our Yiddish classes. But Curt, where can folks find Sholem Aleicham's original
I'll tell you,
text?
This one I can say, I know. Where I went, I turned to the great National Yiddish Book Center in Amherst. I wrote to them, and they were kind enough to send me their printed version of the 29 Moshkeleh and the 41 Moshkeleh. The texts are exactly the same, and by them sending me the Yiddish text, I was able to proceed with my translations. National Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts.
Wonderful, thank you. And we have another question from someone who says, quote, as I listen to you, I am awed by the resource you are to this area of knowledge. Are there others who are doing similar work and along with you who will continue these crucial academic pursuits? And I'll add, perhaps, if folks are interested in getting involved in translation and literature and whatnot, how would you recommend that they get started?
Well, first of all, we have YIVO in New York City. There are places, institutions, universities like Columbia University, where I studied under the late, great, beloved Uriel Weinreich. The City University system has courses in Yiddish. Harvard is a famous institute for Yiddish. University of Texas. I think you could easily Google University Studies Yiddish, and you'll get an entire list of places across this country where one can pursue the study of the language and the literature.
And perhaps as a final question, we have a question from an audience member asking what you think is the future of Yiddish will be, even amongst, they say, ultra-Orthodox. And I'll just expand that to say, what do you think about perhaps the future of Yiddish literature in addition to the Yiddish language?
Well, there is some Yiddish literature being published, but I'll give you an anecdote about how Yiddish plays out in the ultra-Orthodox community. About 2-3 years ago, during the summer before COVID, when we were still circulating and meeting face-to-face, I was up in the Catskills, and I had a yahrzeit for my beloved father, and I knew there were some Hasidic camps in the area. So I drove up on an evening before the evening service, and I asked a little boy who was coming towards me, I said to him in Yiddish, Yingele, du redest Yiddish? Little boy, do you speak Yiddish? And he says, Avade red ich Yiddish. Of course I speak Yiddish. And I said to him, Yingele, hast du da a bibliothek? Meaning, do you have a library here? He looked at me. I says, Du weißt nicht versus bibliothek. You don't know what bibliothek is, right? He said, nein, ich weiß nicht. I said, a bibliothek is behalt Bücher. A bibliothek is a place where books are kept and stored. He says, oh, you mean a library? In other words, he didn't know what the Yiddish word for library was, but he knew the English word library. So that is a little example of how diminutized is the knowledge of Yiddish in the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. I don't know, I can't predict what future holds. I can quote what Isaac Bashevis Singer said at the Nobel dinner, not at the Nobel speech, but at the Nobel dinner, where he said that they keep saying that Yiddish is a dying language. He says, people who die become ghosts. He says, and I believe in ghosts, as you know from my stories. So Isaac Bashevis Singer had a positive outlook. Whether that positive outlook could be matched in reality is very, very difficult to prognosticate.
Wonderful. Well, that's a great note to end on, perhaps. We'll see the ghosts of Yiddish in the future, attending our events and being able to populate all the hopefully future works of Yiddish that will be produced and maybe even translated by folks watching today's lecture.
I hope ghosts have the money to give donations to YIVO and to buy the books.
Absolutely. Folks are welcome to support YIVO if they feel so inclined, and you're certainly welcome to purchase the book to read it yourself if you have not already. Thank you so much, Dvora, for leading Curt in conversation, and thank you, Curt, for your wisdom and, of course, for your work in translating the book. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at future events with YIVO.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zim. Be well.